With a few exciting exhibitions looming next year, I figured it's about time I begin making a few more large pieces. I want to make a few big vases, some jars, and some scaled up versions of some smaller pots I've made, so the two can be paired up and shown together. And so, I took the last lump of clay from one of my bags of stoneware as the day came to an end, so I could throw the pot and leave it in situ overnight, spinning very slowly so it dries out evenly. But first, as always, the clay needs to be thoroughly wedged up. This is a process that removes any tiny pocket of air that might reside inside. It also mixes all the clay together, so any bits of firm clay are blended with the smoother parts. The lump is then curled up in such a way that no pockets of air are incorporated into it, and then the base is rounded, like so, and patted into a more even shape. This way it won't trap air beneath it when it's slammed against the metal wheelhead. This is the piece I hope to scale up. I know I'm not going to get it right the first time, as truthfully, throwing big isn't something I do all too often, but I want to change that next year. It's a simple form, with a narrow foot, an angular body, and an upright, sharp rim. There's no way I'll be able to throw a larger piece like this, in one, with a base this narrow and with a body quite so angular, so I'll likely leave some weight in the bottom half, which I'll then trim back the following day once the pot is turned completely leather hard, which, actually in this cold, damp weather, might take up to even a week. So, let's begin. I wish I knew exactly how much this lump of clay weighed, but I didn't measure it. I slam the piece of soft clay down into the middle of the wheel, roughly centre it and seal the bottom, and then I'll begin coning the clay up and down, which is somewhat like wedging, but on the wheel, and after a few trips up and down, the piece of clay will just feel so much more centred. The analogy I like is that the particles that make up this clay, which we call platelets, before being coned up and down, are all facing in all kinds of directions. There's no order to them, which means water can't flow so easily through it, and by coning it up and down like this, it causes all those platelets to align, which means that water can pass more freely through it, which makes the body more plastic and easier to throw with. This means that especially for larger pieces, it's worth coning up and down a lot more, as dealing with any sort of undulation in the wall or in the rim of the pot is just more difficult, whereas on a smaller scale you can to some degree deal with it. That's the coning part, and for larger lumps of clay it really does help if you're using softer stuff, especially for these initial steps. If you do need to dry the form out later, which is something I should have definitely done when making this piece, as you'll see towards the end, then you can do that with a gas torch or a paint stripper. But trying to centre a larger mass of clay like this with clay that's really firm can be a strenuous and sometimes painful experience, and a good workout. Once the lump of clay feels right and it's passing smoothly beneath my hands, I can move on to the next step, which is opening up the lump of clay and forming the base. To do this, I plunge my index finger and thumb right into the middle, and as soon as I feel any friction, I'll scrape this slip off my hands and move it to the dry spot, as so often it's during this stage when you open up the lump of clay with dry hands that it's drawn off centre. Dry digits stick to the dry clay, which causes the donut shape of stoneware to be moved off centre, and if that isn't corrected at this point, which it can quite easily be, then the undulation in the pot at this point is just exaggerated as the walls are pulled up and the pot is thrown. Once I've pushed down far enough and the depth has been set, I'll then use my fingertips to push the clay out horizontally to form the internal width of the base. Then, prior to my first pull, I'll collar the walls inward, facing upwards in the direction I want them to travel, rather than just splaying outwards somewhat, like they were previously. I also angle the walls so they slope inward. I do this, as naturally when you're pulling the clay up, it'll want to splay outward. So by just angling it in like this, you compensate for that slightly. And instead of pulling up the walls normally, like I do on the right hand side of the pot, I'm instead going to do a heel lift. I do this because as I'm manipulating a larger amount of clay, I want a larger part of my hand to be making contact during this process, as opposed to just the small side of my knuckle, which is what I'd usually use to pull the walls up. And as I'm pulling on the opposite side of the wall, the clay collides with my palm quite abruptly instead of flowing through it like it would if I was pulling on the right hand side of the vessel. I simply dig the bottom portion of my palm into the pot, which in the same instance can cup a tiny amount of water, which helps to keep my hands hydrated as it moves slowly up the outer wall of the pot. On the inside, my right hand is pushing out and forming a lump just above the palm, and it's this lump on the outside my palm is lifting up. and after 2 pulls, I'll collar the whole lot in, and now that the walls have been thinned out considerably, I'll start pulling them up like I normally would, with the soaked sponge pressing in at the bottom on the outside, much like my palm was previously, and my fingers on the inside pushing out to form a bump, which is then very gradually raised up. And gradually really is the word here. Once the clay is pushed in at the bottom and the motion of pulling up is underway, the wheel speed needs to remain consistent, as does the speed at which you move your hands, and the pressure maintained with your fingers as they squeeze. And finally, once your fingers reach the very top of the pot, they should just release that pressure very gently without squeezing all the way through the rim, which might result in leaving a very thin razor's edge, which at this point you definitely don't want. So I push the clay in at the base and form a bulge just above it. My right hand is really moving at the elbow as opposed to at the wrist, and my left hand, which is being held vertically, needs to be tensed even more so as there's not much there really to support it, whereas my right arm is stuffed into my torso and I slightly lean my upper body weight onto it just to keep it stabilised. And you can just look at the throwing rings left in the surface of your pot in order to see whether you've been pulling evenly or not. And ideally, you want your hands to always be moving. If, as you're pulling, you let your fingers linger in one spot for too long, you can end up creating a thin spot, and if that's in the wrong place, or near the bottom especially, with all the extra weight of the walls above it, then this can cause that part of the wall to buckle, which means the pot might twist and then collapse. After each pull, I like to collar the walls in from bottom to top, like I just did, just to keep the cylinder nice and neat. With the height getting there, I can begin to roughly add the shape I want to this pot, which is a sharp, angular waist with a narrow top and bottom. Yet when I'm shaping the piece, I don't want to just try and pull the final form in one movement. Instead, with a pot this size, I want to get there gradually, so I'll ease it out and slowly let the form take shape. And once the curve in the body is roughly there, I'll then begin to throw in the more distinct angles, which is normally when things begin to go wrong. And I think in the future, before I do this, I should just blast over this really soaking surface with the gas torch, just to firm the clay up, so it can be altered more easily without any slight wobbles appearing in the walls. With the midpoint thrown in the waste, I then begin angling the upper section of the wall, which is supported the entire time with a hand on the inside, which is being pushed up against the edge of my thumb on the outside. At this point I felt like the waist was a bit too low down, so I shifted it up 2 inches, so it would more or less be halfway up, and then I throw and refine each plane of the pot, thinning the walls out a bit, and as the top half was sagging inwards, I had to really push quite dramatically up and out from the inside, and at this point, this upper section of the wall was getting really quite thin, but I still wasn't quite happy with the shape, so I'd need to do another more dramatic pull after this, in order to get it to a point I was more happy with. And with the shape more or less there, the final bit of shaping can begin, and you'll really see through this sped up section just how much the pot changes as I scrape away much of the excess clay from the outer walls and really refine the shape. And you'll also see, as I do that, how quite an annoying undulation appears in the waist, which is entirely my fault, but I was confident I'd be able to fix it once I'd got the shape more or less there and allowed the piece to dry out for about 15 minutes or so. So I continued as best I could despite it, and once most of that liquidy, slippy clay had been scraped away, I'd be able to correct the rim before moving on to the final few steps. To remove the slight wavering in the very top, I held one of my old turning tools against the clay very steadily, just so it removed only the highest point in the wall. And then I took my chamois leather and smothered the top, just to smooth the clay here and even it out. I then took the same blunted turning tool and removed this skirt of clay from around the bottom of the pot, and I'm careful as I do this that I don't let too much clay accumulate beneath the blade, as if too much does, and then that lump of clay collides with the wall of the pot, it can really screw things up. I then run my brass kidney over that same area just to create a cleaner surface. And then I lowered a sponge inside the vessel to soak up the water that remained, as if I left this in the pot overnight, it would ensure that the clay down there stays very damp, and if there's too much water, it can even degrade the clay to the point that the pot might collapse. And at this point, and at the end of the day, I cleaned up, but left the pot spinning very slowly in situ. And it's after this, although sadly not filmed, that I spent just 5 minutes pushing the clay up very carefully against the kidney just to correct the obvious undulation there previously was. And with that, I'll let the pot now dry out very slowly overnight as it spins. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.